Thanks for being on.
Thank you so much. And good afternoon, everyone. I'll get right into it. And, you know, being a climate guy, the March is in the rearview mirror, but I always like to talk a little bit about what we've just experienced. And indeed, it was if you think it was a warmer or fairly mild March, it was. The map on the upper left of Missouri does show the departure for normal temperatures, and you can see generally about 4 to 6 degrees above normal for the month of March. We had some very mild conditions, and it was nice to see after that Arctic blast we had in the middle part of February, and March came in pretty much like a lamb. And you can see the numbers on the lower left from day to day. I use Columbia, Missouri as a midpoint for the state, and you can see the day-to-day high and low temperatures compared to the normals. The high temperatures in the pink and the minimum temperatures from day to day, and those in blue, and then the averages are in orange, average high, and then average low are in the darker blues. And you could see we started out very mild about the first 10 days of March, a little bit more of a cooler, unsettled period. We had some frequent periods of rain for about 10 days, and then it started to warm up a little bit more during the last week. But overall, it was a mild March, and it was a wet March. In the upper right, you can see departure from normal precipitation for the month of March. All greens are indicative of above normal precip. You can see generally the statewide average was probably about 4 to 5 inches. Lighter totals in far northern Missouri on the Iowa border. A little bit of pocket of lighter totals in east central Missouri. Heaviest precip in southeast and parts of southwest Missouri, running 3 to more than 5 inches above normal. And then the table on the lower right shows some of the highest March totals, all in southwestern Missouri, parts of west central Missouri, anywhere from 8 to almost a foot of rain in Anderson, McDonald County in the far southwest corner of the state. And those lighter totals in the bottom right show generally 2 to 3 inches of precip, which still isn't too bad for the month of March. Now we're into April, and boy, it just came in pretty cold, I'll tell you that. Some of the coldest temperatures we've seen in quite a few weeks for that matter, running well below normal, and the numbers are just now coming in. And you can see we had a killing freeze. We had a severe freeze across much of northern Missouri, even pockets of central where those numbers got down to 24 degrees or less. Some northern areas got down to 19 degrees. That was the coldest temperature I could find, at least what's been coming in. That was in Sullivan County in north central Missouri, just north of Green City. But low 20s were common pretty much across northern Missouri, mid 20s, mid to upper 20s across the rest of the state. Even those low-lying areas of the Ozarks dipped pretty low. I see in Round Spring over there in Shannon County, they got down to 21 degrees this morning. So some very cold temperatures. Pretty much the entire state witnessed freezing temperatures. The only exception would be the far southeastern tip of the Boot Hill, where they just barely managed to stay away from that 32-degree line. But very cold temperatures and some killing freeze, moderate freezes experienced across much of the state. We have one more day of this cold weather. I don't think it's going to be as intense as at least for the western half of Missouri for tomorrow morning. On the left, you can see those maps showing freeze warnings continued for tomorrow morning, where they're expecting temperatures to drop into the 20s across quite a bit of the state, about the eastern 2/3 of Missouri. In western parts of the section, those lighter blues that you see on the map on the left, that's a frost advisories. They're expecting the temperatures not to be so drastic like they were this morning, maybe hovering right around the freezing mark in those far western counties. And the map on the right does show the forecasted low temperatures tomorrow morning. And you can see the core of that cold air is shifting eastward, but still nipping about the eastern half of the state, especially eastern Missouri, where those lows can dip into the middle 20s on the Iowa or on the Illinois and the Missouri border. So some cold conditions again, moderate to severe freezes, especially across the eastern parts of Missouri. That will be the last we see of freezing temperatures for some time, I will note. And it does look like we are on the heading to above normal temperatures starting this weekend into Saturday and Sunday, and not a lot of rainfall predicted, little to no precip over the next 7 days. So with that in mind and warmer temperatures, we're going to see a southerly wind on Saturday and Sunday that could be gusting 15 to 25 miles per hour. We haven't really seen a lot of rain over a week to 10 days. And so any dry fuels out there and windy conditions, low humidities could lead to some red flag warnings, probably being posted by the National Weather Service as we go into Saturday and especially Sunday, and especially in Sunday when those temperatures get into the 70s, and they're anticipating 70s, mid to upper 70s, even lower 80s for much of next week. So that's more typical of what you would see towards the end of spring, well into May versus going right into the month of April. So some dry and warm weather is on the horizon for the next several days. This is the forecast over the next 6 to 10 days, which will take us April 6th through April 10th. It does look very warm. And that the deeper those shades of red, the higher the confidence the forecasters have that this forecast will verify. And there is a strong confidence that you can see right in the middle of the country, encompassing all of Missouri, some high probabilities that we will see above normal temperatures for next week. The map on the right is precipitation chances for next week. It does look like towards the middle and end of next week, perhaps there could be more of an unsettled pattern, impacting especially the northern parts of the country where you see those greens. That's an enhanced likelihood of above normal precipitation. A little bit that slices into northeast Missouri, more equal chances or near normal precipitation across much of the rest of the state. And then that southwestern corner of Missouri does look like there perhaps more drier conditions are possible. I will say that as we roll into the spring season, climatologically, those precipitation totals, they go up. Average statewide precipitation for the month of April is about 4 inches, a little over 4 inches, and our wettest month is the month of May. So even though it does seem near normal for precip, starting the middle part of next week, it looks like we will see a more unsettled weather pattern. And by then, we could stand to use a little bit of rain because it's been fairly dry lately. I will show this map. It just came out yesterday. It's the forecast for the month of April. On the left, you can see there's pretty good confidence that April, according to the forecasters, will be a warmer than normal month. On the right, it's a toss-up. The EC is equal chances for above, below, and near normal precipitation. So the forecasters really don't have a very good grasp on the type of pattern that's going to set up in regard to precipitation, but they do show some confidence for an above normal month for the month of April across much of the country. And that stripe that extends from the upper Midwest down into Texas, that's the highest likelihood that they expect this forecast will verify for the month of April. Real quickly, we do have a frost freeze probabilities guide, a collaboration with the Integrated Pest Management Program and the Missouri Climate Center. We put together a frost freeze guide where you can get all sorts of information to get an idea of when you would anticipate that average last date that in the spring you would see a freezing temperature or a killing freeze or a moderate freeze. The website is on the bottom that you can see there to get to this online guide to look at these various maps and some points showing the frost freeze probabilities, not only for the spring, but for the fall as well. So that's pretty much it, Patrick. I'll thank you so much for the opportunity, and I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Pat. Jim, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do, Patrick. Yes, we both Patricks. I'm sorry. Did you all see this question? It's with warming. Are we concerned about drought expanding in Missouri?
That is always a possibility. I do know that the seasonal outlook was looking a little bit more concerning. Of course, when you have above normal temperatures, you're going to create higher evaporative demand. So those soils will dry out quicker if the rains don't come. We're seeing more sunshine, hotter temperatures. And if we don't get an unsettled pattern, things can dry out pretty quickly here in Missouri. So I'm hoping, at least if we keep an eye on that 6 to 10 day outlook which updates every day, hopefully we'll see some continuity in seeing that green encompass more of our state, which would signal to me more of an unsettled pattern. And that's pretty typical. We're getting into the severe weather season. We see these unsettled patterns set up. We see day-to-day chances of some showers, and hopefully that will verify, because in the extended period with above normal temperatures and lots of sunshine as we go into April and May, that dries things out pretty quickly. So hopefully that will be the case. We'll see definitely warmer temperatures, but more unsettled weather accompanying that by the end of next week.
Thank you, Pat. That's all I've got.
Okay, thank you, Pat, for the weather report. And let's get the screen. So we'll move on to our next speaker for the day, and kind of our main topic for the day. And Jordan Thomas, Assistant Extension Professor, State Beef Cattle Reproduction Specialist with MU Extension. He's going to talk about management swings around the spring breeding season. And so, Jordan, floor is yours.
Thank you, Patrick. Hopefully everybody can see those slides. So my topic today is, just as Patrick said, is sort of the management swings or things that we might encounter as cows approach a spring breeding season. And there's actually several things. It's kind of a tough time of year to navigate, as you all know. So what are some of those things? I always like to start out here just to give a little context, which is, early conception within the breeding season is how we make money in the cow-calf business. It's really critical that cattle conceive early, as early as possible in the breeding season. And so I'm a lot less worried about total pregnancy rate by the end of a breeding season or how long that breeding season is, but I want to have a large proportion of the cows conceiving very early in the breeding season so they go on to calve early in the calving season. And the reason for that is if you think about two different cows, and the cow on the top, for example, conceives on the first day of this spring breeding season, calves on the first day of this spring calving or winter calving season in this case, there's a period of time in which she's not cycling. She has to return to have normal estrus cycles, but that cow has a lot of time to actually do that and still maintain this annual season that we're trying to accomplish. But the cow that conceives on the last day of the breeding season and calves on the last day of the calving season is really a different story, because there's this portion of the next year in which she is not even cycling during that next breeding season and doesn't even have the opportunity to conceive early. She may have just one opportunity in a 60-day breeding season to conceive. And if you think about that from a commercial profitability perspective, I think it's easy to see which of those two cows actually stands to generate the most, what I call gross margin per unit, which is kind of the most profit margin for an individual cow. And it's this cow that conceives early, no doubt about it. Not only is she going to wean an older and heavier calf that is of a higher weight at weaning, but as a result of that, she'll wean a higher percentage of her body weight, all those metrics that we like to see. But she'll also have a lower cost. And it's hard to articulate that, but because those early conceiving cows stay in the herd for a longer period of time and are less likely to be just marketed as young females that are open at preg check, we really have less costs associated with their development costs that we have to depreciate out over their years of ownership. So that's another topic for another time, but this is why we're really interested in management around the time of breeding, because we don't want to compromise early breeding season pregnancy rate. It's really critical. So some of what I'm going to talk about today is really nutrition related. And so Eric Bailey and I just talked on the phone, and I said, make sure I don't step on any of your toes, because Eric is a great nutritionist and obviously does a great job serving the state as the state specialist. I'm going to touch on some nutritional topics in terms of how they interact with reproduction. But I know that one thing that we all agree on is that nutrition in cattle and humans in general is actually kind of weird in the way that it works, because the body has priorities. And we don't often think about that, but there's this concept of nutrient partitioning where the body's going to preferentially use nutrition for some of these basic functions, basal metabolism, the activity to go gather food or growth, basic energy reserves, far before we start thinking about things that are really important from a production standpoint, like that she maintains her current pregnancy, or that she lactates for her calf at side, or that she, has enough energy reserves in terms of body condition. And it's important to know that estrus cyclicity, or her ability to have normal estrus cycles and potentially become pregnant, and her ability to become pregnant that's kind of the lowest priority that she has, other than just adding on excess body condition. And so I always think about it as a fountain, with one of those fancy fountains that has all the tiers, right? If I don't have enough water to fill up this top one, there's not enough to run down to fill up some of these lower tiers. And that's really the way nutrition in cattle works as well. And so it's important that we're meeting an animal's nutritional requirements for some of these basic functions, or we're never going to get estrus cyclicity and pregnancy rate to occur. So one way we monitor that in cattle, of course, is just by monitoring body condition. Because when we see at this severe reduction in body condition, say in the case of a body condition score 3 or 4 animal, or even worse, those animals, we know they don't have this moderate energy reserve available, and it's pretty unlikely that there's enough water running down into those lower tiers of the fountain, right? It's unlikely that we're going to get good pregnancy rates. And really the data bears that out. If we just look at, what is the body condition score of cows in terms of their likelihood of becoming pregnant, cows in good body condition, obviously we have higher pregnancy percentages, higher pregnancy rates in those cows. Cows in low body condition, we have lower pregnancy rates. I think we all know that. But it's important to realize that we can't just overcome these body condition score challenges with the level of energy that we feed into cows around the time of calving, or shortly after calving, shortly prior to calving. We really need to have a year-long management program that maintains or adds body condition appropriately to cows so that they calve in an appropriate body condition, which this data is in heifers. And so in heifers, we like to see heifers calving at a body condition score 6. In cows, of course, we're able to be more in the 5 to 5.5 range. But in heifers, if you look at this data from 1994, it's a nice publication. They just looked at heifers that were having their first calf at either a body condition score 4 or 5 or body condition score 6 or 7. And then they overlaid some treatments related to how they added or potentially lost weight up to the point of calving. And what you can see is that in these thin animals, even these pretty aggressive rates of weight gain up to the point of calving really didn't compensate for the fact that she was calving at a thin condition. And so it's really important to manage body condition score. But it's also important to realize that that's not the whole story. And so this is where we get into these management swings that can occur around the time of a spring breeding season. So let's talk through what that looks like. So we're going to ask cows to make a turn this time of year in terms of the quality of the diet that we're offering them, or at least the composition of the diet that we're offering them. And we may be turning down a very favorable road, right? We're turning towards green grass. So we think that's a good thing. But, with any corner that you make, there's potential for a wreck depending on how difficult that turn is to make, how abrupt that turn is. And much the same way with cattle, if we make this transition a gentle transition, we're far less likely to cause some problems than if we make it a really abrupt transition. And we can even send cows backwards if we turn them on to what seems to be a good forage base, but we do that in such an abrupt way. So here's some data that really gets at that. If you look at extreme restrictions, even in cows that are, or in this case, the data is going to be some heifer data, but even in heifers that have appropriate levels of condition, if you then extremely restrict nutrition, we know that you can completely shut down estrus cyclicity. So here's an extreme example. This is a 1994 paper where they restricted heifers that had been on about 125% of maintenance requirements, all the way down to 40% of maintenance requirements. And half of those heifers stopped ovulating within 2 weeks. Now that is extreme. And I don't think anybody's going to put heifers through that kind of an extreme restriction, but know that that is something that can happen, right? We can shut down cyclicity 100% completely in certain heifers by restricting energy to that level. Now, in the literature that has looked at more modest restrictions, they also still find some negative effects. And so, for example, here's one paper in which they restricted, again, from being at about 125% of maintenance requirements down to just 85% of maintenance requirements, which doesn't sound like all that extreme of a reduction. And they just did that for one estrus cycle prior to breeding. And what they found was reduced pregnancy rates. And so it appears that nutritional restrictions around the time of breeding really can influence reproductive performance. And this is data in heifers. But note that it's not necessarily a heifer specific phenomenon, because there's some nice data, older data, but also a pretty new paper that has shown some reductions in embryo quality when restrictions occur either before or even slightly after breeding. So this 2017 paper, for example, they restricted nutrition actually after AI and showed a reduction in embryo quality as a function of that. And that may sound like a very wild thing, and it certainly is difficult to explain all of the mechanisms involved in that. But I really do believe that nutrition around the time of breeding can have more of a negative impact on reproductive performance than we might think. So let's talk about what actually is going on right now. So if you think about the nutritional requirements of, let's say, just a 1,200 pound cow, and I know most of our cows these days are not 1,200 pounds, but just to conceptualize what exactly is happening in terms of her nutrient requirements, her crude protein and energy requirements throughout the year, they essentially mirror each other, right? But around the time of calving, we have the highest requirements that we are going to have in the production cycle of that female. And if you think about when breeding needs to occur, somewhere in this range, we are still at a time point in the production cycle when energy and protein requirements of this cow are very high. Of course, at the time of weaning, we are at her lowest requirement time point after we get that calf weaned off and she's still in relatively early to mid gestation. And then late gestation, those requirements start to build back up again. So the question is always, if we're trying to have a cost-effective commercial program, well, did we line up these requirements with the level of energy and the level of protein that's just provided by the forage, right? We can think of systems in which these are really in sync, and we can think of systems in which they're really out of sync. And if they're really out of sync, then we need to provide some supplementation because the forage isn't going to cut it. So, in a true spring calving situation, which would be if you're calving right now, right? If you're calving right now, well, then you're breeding in the summer. And that's really what spring calving is, right? Now, very few producers in the state of Missouri actually do this. And I think there are some reasonable reasons why we don't do this. But in that situation, a true spring calving situation, there's really not this same concern with the transition to green growing forage, at least during the time of the breeding season, because that's going to have already occurred, right now around the time of calving. And so in those systems, our big challenge is really the summer breeding season. And that's often, why producers in Missouri in particular do not do true spring calving in most cases, because, we have heat stress that time of year. We've got high humidity. We're challenged with fescue toxicosis, especially if that's the only forage base that we have access to. And then if that is if we're in a cool season forage base, there's also potential that we are really going into the summer slump around the time of breeding season, and we don't have the forage quantity, but also the forage quality, especially if it's been allowed to go reproductive and make seed heads and so on and so forth. So again, not very common in the state of Missouri. So when I hear people say spring calving, I always hear air quotes around that, because spring calving in Missouri is really winter calving, right? If the breeding season is happening right now, which is the spring, that means that calving really occurred in the winter. And I don't say that to shame anyone, because I think there are reasons that we do this, but we need to be honest about what the cow's requirements actually are in a winter calving situation compared to a true spring calving situation. Again, there may be a good reason to do this, but if you think about what's happening right now, or what we are in the midst of, we have had cow requirements that far exceeded the available forage base, but we have this rapid change in the quality of that forage base as it turns green and begins to grow. And I think we have to be very careful as we turn cows out onto this forage, because we have to understand that this is an animal that has essentially the highest requirements that she's going to have in her production cycle. And it's a really critical time at which we need to get early breed up in cows for them to be really commercially productive. So in a winter calving situation, I'm going to call it that just to be clear, in a winter calving spring breeding situation, breeding's occurring during this transition to green growing forage. And so what is the challenge of green growing forage? It's washy. What does that mean? When we talk about washy forage, we're usually talking about two things. Most people think we're talking about moisture, and of course we are. It's very high moisture content, 80%. But it's also high in protein. I worry a little bit less about the protein piece of it than maybe some do, but it is certainly high in moisture. And so if we're turning cattle out onto this kind of lush, washy pasture too early, we can really see reduced cattle performance. And the data bears that out, not only with our perennial forages, but also with our annual forages like wheat, that have these really high moisture contents and high protein contents. Now, the other disadvantage of turning cattle out onto forage too early in the spring is by grazing that forage at that stage, we're really depleting some nutrient reserves that grass plant really needs. And so we're going to impair regrowth potential. The data is, a little mixed on how much we actually reduce it, but it could certainly be 40% or more of the total annual forage yield that we actually reduce just by going in and asking the cattle to bite that first bit of growth off. So there's two pieces. I'm mostly focused on the cattle performance piece in this talk, but just bear in mind that from an economic standpoint, I don't think any of us on the call today can afford a 40% reduction in the forage yield for the year. So on the cattle side, what kind of turn are we going to ask those cows to make during the spring breeding season? Is it going to be this gentle curve, or is it going to be an abrupt right angle, or are we going to send cows backwards? Here's an example in which they really sent cows backwards. So this is a 2015 paper out of George Perry's group. George Perry's at Texas A&M University now, had previously been at South Dakota State. He's a Mizzou alum, did his graduate work in Mike Smith's program. And they did an interesting trial in which, actually a series of interesting trials, in which they have had heifers that were in a dry lot development situation or in a pasture development situation, and then turned both groups of cattle, both groups of heifers, out to pasture immediately after AI. And so I don't have the figure on this slide to show you their activity before AI, but before AI, the pasture developed heifers, as you might expect, are walking more. So they put pedometers on these heifers, and the pasture heifers, of course, they're out grazing, they are walking more. The lot developed heifers are walking less. But then they turned both groups out to pasture the day of AI, and the lot developed heifers way outpaced the pasture developed heifers in terms of the number of steps taken. And so those lot developed heifers have this extreme increase in activity the days following AI as they were turned out to pasture conditions that they weren't familiar with, arguably had to quote unquote learn to graze. And those heifers crashed in terms of their reproductive performance. Now, George Perry's done a series of trials on this topic. And so I'm going to take some of the highlights from different papers. But essentially what happens when you do this is these heifers that were on a pasture-based development program, they may not have extremely high rates of average daily gain. In this case, it's reasonable for sure. But those heifers are maintaining that gain in the period after quote unquote turnout, whereas these heifers that were in a more normal type of development situation, more of a lot type of development system, where they're turned out to the same pasture conditions, their average daily gains crash. So there's something about prior grazing experience in heifers that is a little bit hard to explain, but I think very interesting. And George Perry's group tends to explain this as prior grazing experience. And I think their data is compelling because there's not a lot of differences in those heifers in terms of the development points they were developed to. But this behavior associated with grazing activity and these huge increases in activity that we can see when heifers are turned out to pasture, if they have not been exposed to pasture and grazing conditions before, can really be detrimental for their pregnancy success. So this is their first service pregnancy rate. And you can see that even though the lot developed heifers had a large proportion cyclic, they actually had a lower pregnancy rate in terms of their first service pregnancy rate to AI. And presumably because of, again, this reduction in average daily gain and this nutritional restriction. And again, Dr. Perry's group has done some nice work on the embryo side of things as well to really tie that to embryo quality. So in terms of some practical recommendations, I'm going to try to keep this practical. If you're turning out heifers, what do you do? If at all possible, I would really consider whether your heifer development program involves grazing. If you're planning to turn out spring, spring calving, winter calving heifers fairly abruptly to pasture, if those heifers have never been asked to graze and are not really familiar with those kinds of pasture conditions, you at least need to recognize that that's a pretty abrupt transition. That's a hard right angle turn and potentially even a U-turn. So if at all possible, design a program where grazing experience and grazing is an expectation involved in that heifer development program. The other practical piece is, this hasn't exactly been done, but limiting the size of the pasture or the paddock to which heifers are turned into seems to be a practical recommendation. There hasn't necessarily been a controlled experiment to show that that fixes this problem, and I don't know that it would fix all of it. But by limiting the size of the pasture, or using some temporary fence to keep heifers from walking the entire perimeter of a new pasture, we ought to be able to at least bring down the level of energy that they expend doing that as they are exposed to new pasture. So that seems to be a practical recommendation. Certainly something worth trying. If I had heifers that I had no other choice about, turn out from a lot to pasture, I would certainly be doing this to try to limit the size of that pasture, or identify smaller pastures I could turn them into. So I ideally also transition them down relatively slowly to pasture from a hay and supplement or a total mixed ration kind of development program. So what does that mean? In some of the work that has been done, if you provide some supplementation to deal with this challenge, we can alleviate some of these reductions. And so continuing to provide supplementation, even when turned out to high quality pasture, and stepping down the level of supplementation somewhat slowly over time, makes a lot of sense. The other really practical thing that I would try to point out is, we've got a culture in Missouri of developing heifers to be really fleshy prior to breeding. Just seems to be the culture, not so much in some other parts of the country. But I would really carefully consider whether you're developing heifers to an appropriate target weight or you're overdeveloping heifers. So having a greater rate of gain prior to breeding than after breeding, so in other words, a greater rate of gain pre-breeding than post-breeding, I think that's actually unwise based on the data that's out there, and it's certainly costly. So a good rule of thumb is that a moderate heifer that is gaining weight is you'd rather have that than a fleshy heifer that is losing weight, because what this energy restriction can do as we go into the breeding season. The only caveat I would give there is we can't compromise puberty attainment. So you have to have a development program that is capable of generating puberty with the kind of genetics that you have in your operation. And so we can't overly restrict heifers, obviously. Or if we do, we at least need to be honest that we're going to need to develop more heifers in order to do that. But again, these overdevelopment programs, I think, are kind of problematic. I'll give you an example. So consider cow size and heifer development really factors into all this. So when I think about cow size and heifer development, I'm often going to talk about it. What percent of a cow's mature weight are we developing heifers to? So a common one over the years has been 65% of mature weight. And that's been a pretty common recommendation, but it's honestly kind of an aggressive recommendation. It's a fairly high recommendation. It's a fairly high target weight. Now you can ensure some reasonable rates of puberty attainment with that. But think of what that actually is for, say, a 1,300 pound cow. And I would argue most of our cows are still probably above 1,300, but 845 pounds would be the target weight in that case of a 65% target weight. Now consider a 55% target weight. And there's a lot of good research showing that a 55% target weight in, British-based animals that have some good genetics for earlier puberty attainment, this can be really effective, cost effective, and then also effective for generating good rates of puberty attainment. That's a very different target weight, right? That's 715 pounds for a 1,300 pound cow. So if you consider those two options, if a 65% target weight on the right, that's a target weight that, often we're going to have a fairly good supplementation program or a total mixed ration to meet that. But it's also going to set her up to have greater maintenance requirements going into the breeding season, right? So an animal that weighs more has a higher maintenance energy requirement that we need to meet during the breeding season. And so there's really more potential for these overdeveloped heifers that get kicked out to grass to struggle in that transition and to struggle in maintaining a rate of gain that was pretty similar to what they had been managed to attain with supplementation. Now, on the other side of the equation, with a 55% target weight, often we can hit that pre-breeding development goal on forages or on crop residues with modest levels of supplementation. In some cases on forage, we may be able to do that with no supplementation if we're really good forage managers. And then we've got an animal that is a lower maintenance requirement animal going into the breeding season and may actually undergo compensatory gain as she's given access to high quality pasture. There's a lot of good data, admittedly in more warm season type of country. Rick Funston's program out of Nebraska has some nice data, really getting at this concept of a lower pre-breeding development goal for heifers, but then this nice potential for compensatory gain on pasture. So heifer selection and your management practices around heifer selection really are going to influence that. You're going to arguably need to develop more heifers if you use a lighter development goal, et cetera, et cetera. That's way beyond what we have time to talk about today, but I do have a pretty extensive extension publication on this topic. Just came out here in the last couple of weeks on selection of replacement heifers for commercial beef operations. And so I would refer you to that, and happy to answer some questions about that some other time. Now, in terms of cows, I think on the heifer side of things, there's a lot to think about. There's probably less to think about on the cow side of things. Cows are a lower, a lower maintenance animal, let's be honest. But at the same time, for cows, we still have potential to really impact embryo quality, by these nutrient restrictions. And so I want to ensure that at the time of turnout for cows, I've got body condition score really where I want it to be. I haven't had this steep decline in body condition since calving. That can obviously mess up reproductive performance. But I really want to watch the forage quantity when I'm turning cows out into the pasture. Remember, cows are a fairly high capacity animal. They can go harvest a lot of feed, and this is feed that is pretty low in its dry matter content. And so if I'm going to turn cows out onto this really wetter forage, they're going to consume a lot of it. And they need to consume a lot of it to get close to meeting their energy requirements. So often a problem is we overestimate the quantity of forage available in the fields when we actually turn cows out. And that can be a problem. They can really overgraze pretty easily. The other piece from a quality standpoint is, again, remember, this is lush forage. It's high in protein and moisture, but it's low in fiber and energy. And so in cows, we very well could send cows backwards in terms of whether they're meeting their energy requirements due to this moisture content. So this is, cows are going to struggle to eat enough of this wet forage just based on the fact that, their rumen can only hold so much to actually meet their energy requirements. And so we're dealing with this high passage feed stuff that is difficult for them to actually meet their energy requirements on, depending on what we're talking about in terms of the age class of cows. So I'm a lot less concerned about running age cows, mature cows, but 2 and 3 year old cows especially, they're a meaningfully different critter. And so they still have requirements for their own growth. They're trying to reach their mature size. They are nursing their first or second calf, right? In the case of 2 year olds, we're dealing with some teeth changes too. And if you see poor pregnancy rates in 2 year old cows or 3 year old cows, obviously there could be so many different causes for that. But often these problems associated with nutritional status, you're going to realize those problems specifically in young cows more so than older cows, just because these young cows are our high risk population of cows within the herd. So I would consider this, if you are not necessarily willing to invest in a supplementation program for older cows, and we could debate whether you ought to or ought not, at least consider whether it makes sense to supplement young cows, because in some cases, I think you can make an argument that it does. If you don't separate young cows from older cows, and you start supplementing, those older cows are going to get the majority of the supplement. It's going to there's some dominance issues in cow groups that are going to keep young cows from really achieving the level of supplementation that we want them to get when we do begin to provide supplement. And so managing young cows as a separate group is often, a reasonable thing to do. And the other piece of that is just consider the fact that in these young cows, if I don't get them rebred, that's a pretty substantial reduction in their value. And so that's a group of cows that I think we can afford some supplementation in, more so than we can in a group of older cows, just trying to manage this depreciation cost. Again, probably another topic for another time, but I am thinking very specifically about young cows when I think about some of these challenges of washy forage during the turnout during the breeding season. So what about dry hay during the green up, providing dry hay on pasture? Now, this is maybe an unfortunate picture because this is obviously far beyond the early green spring growth. But if you think about trying to provide dry hay on pasture when it's lush and washy in the spring, I think you need to be careful with that recommendation because, for a winter calving cow, she has, again, the highest nutrient requirements that she's really going to have during her production cycle from calving up until breeding. And when we provide dry hay, it's important to realize that's not a supplement. It's a substitute, right? We're substituting, not supplementing. And so that hay intake is going to reduce the intake of the high quality forage, and that hay quality is generally going to be insufficient to meet her energy requirements. And energy is really our challenge in this case. We're trying to meet the energy demands of a lactating cow going into the breeding season. So we see this happen a lot. I'm not sure that it's really the most practical strategy, especially when we're trying to fight mud and things like that this time of year. And I'm also not sure it's really the most profitable use of a dollar in terms of trying to essentially accomplish supplementation when we're really substituting. So a general recommendation that I would give for this topic is, if you can actually maintain some stockpiled forage to be on in March and have cows eating a mixture of last year's growth as new spring growth is coming up through it, that's about as gentle a corner as I can ask cows to make. But that's pie in the sky for many of us because many of us have harvested that stockpile when it's at its highest feed value, which is earlier in the fall. But just realize that, the feed value of a resource is maybe different from the value of a resource. And a stockpile this late in the year is actually a pretty valuable resource. And so if I'm going to have to feed some hay, I'm going to think strategically about actually feeding some hay at a different time of the year so that I can preserve some stockpile to be on this time of year. That's a little bit of a bizarre recommendation, but I think there's some merit to it and at least something to consider. Now, we're still dealing with the same considerations. It's much like feeding dry hay, right? So we may not be meeting the cow's energy requirements. We're going to deal with that dry matter issue and that moisture content issue. But for a winter calving cow, meeting energy demands this time of year is still a challenge. So I don't know that eliminates the need for supplementation on pasture, but just one consideration for how to deal with that washiness. The other piece is, of course, delay turnout to allow forage to mature longer. So whether that's a longer period of feeding in a sacrifice lot or in a pen, what we're doing there is we're buying time. And I'm not a big advocate for hay intensive management systems on the cow-calf side. I sort of loathe hay. But if there's a time to be strategic about hay use, it's any time that it enables you to buy additional forage growth. So think through those considerations. The other piece is just obviously provide supplementation to meet energy requirements and think about that specifically in young cows. And so if we're trying to meet energy requirements there, we're thinking about an energy type of feed stuff, right? So work with either your state nutrition specialist or your local regional livestock specialist in terms of what makes sense. Lastly, I just got a few slides to share with you about transportation because I realize as we're trying to transition cows to green grass, often we're trying to actually load cows onto something and get them there because many of us operate with some lease pastures or fairly extensive operations where we actually do need to transport cattle around. So beware that transportation during the breeding season is detrimental. and there's no bones about that. If we're transporting cattle during the breeding season, during gestation, it's pretty likely with it, we're going to have some detrimental impacts. So the question is just, when can we do so where it's not extremely detrimental? So this is a combination of a couple of papers, but essentially there's been a couple of papers. There's not a lot of published work in this, but there's a couple papers where they have tried to, load cattle onto a pot after AI, immediately after AI, drive them around and turn them right back out, and just see what the transportation impact actually was on those cows. And so if you do that, for example, between days 8 and 12 after AI, a pretty severe reduction in the pregnancy rate that was actually obtained. If you do that a little bit later, still a pretty substantial reduction. And you know what, even later in gestation, it may be surprising to see this data, but even, as far out as 60 days, we're still having fairly substantial reductions in pregnancy rate as a result of that transportation. So it's going to have an impact. As we get into, second and third trimester, we expect that to continue to go down. But in general, transporting pregnant cows is a risky thing to do. Now, if you do an AI program, you'll notice here, from day 1 to 4, they don't show this reduction. And so that gets into my recommendation on this slide. If you're doing AI, I sure wouldn't move cows the day of AI or the day after. And it's for a different reason. It's that we might actually delay ovulation and reduce fertility to that. So reduce fertilization rates as a result of that. Certainly could be the case. That it looks like, based on the data for pregnancy loss, the safest window to move cows after AI is actually between day 2 and day 5 after AI. Now, the challenge, though, right, is if you're using natural service, or if you're using natural service after AI, all throughout the rest of the breeding season, we don't know when breeding took place. And so we really can't manage the timing of shipment to try to deal with that, because certain cows may have been serviced by the bull, yesterday. And so, just limit shipment of cattle if at all possible. We don't want to interfere with the mating process, obviously, but also we don't want to cause some embryonic loss. So ideally, you want to plain grazing so that we just don't have to do this, but obviously that's wishful thinking for many of us. Minimize the stress. If you do need to transport cattle, there's essentially no research on this, but if we can keep our handling as low stress as possible, at least we're doing the best we can. And so I think that looks like, emphasizing low stress stockmanship to every single person that's going to handle those cattle along the way, including yourself, right? At least in my case, I got to keep myself in check just as much as anybody else. But if you're stressed, the cattle are likely to be pretty stressed too. So low stress stockmanship around the time of cattle loading or penning and moving those cattle around, I think is really important if we're at any of these critical time points. The other thing is, just from a practical standpoint, depending on when the shipping is occurring, I think you really want to minimize the time that they're penned, the time that they're off feed, the time they're not grazing, the time they're away from water, and just try to be very conscientious, because these are again, potentially early pregnant females when we really need them to be pregnant. If you're moving cattle by foot, there's really not any evidence that moving cattle down the road by foot causes losses. But that said, it hasn't really been studied. And so I would just be mindful of what kind of distance and what kind of time we're going to ask cows to walk if we are going to move cattle around during the breeding season, and just try to keep it not very extreme. And then the other piece is, often if we are moving cattle around, it's because we're trying to get them to pastures that have forage as compared to those that don't. And so be mindful of pasture size that we're turning cows out into. You introduce any animal into a fairly novel environment, and she's going to walk a lot, and she's going to try to figure out every corner of that pasture and where it is, and every water point in there. So novel pastures can be problematic in terms of just getting these big increases in energy, and obviously be mindful of just all the other things there, especially as the breeding season continues to drag on and we start to think about water and shade access. If I'm going to transport cattle around, I want to make sure that I'm dumping those cows out into places that I can begin to bring down body temperature, depending on whether I've whether I'm actually shipping cattle at a time point that's actually pretty hot. So that's all I've got today. If you want to keep in touch, I do maintain a YouTube channel, Mizzou Repro, Facebook page by the same name, and we post some content there pretty regularly. And happy to answer some questions on there if you have some, and you can always get a hold of me by email or phone as well. But any questions I can try to answer.
Jim, do we have any questions?
Yes, Jordan and Patrick, we do have a couple of questions if you're ready for them.
You bet.
Yeah, Jordan, I think you've been talking a lot about winter calving, or maybe some people call them spring calving cows, going into the spring breeding season. But how do some of these considerations, if we're dealing with a late summer or a fall calving group of females?
Yeah, honestly, I think in that case, we're really not nearly as worried about these kinds of swings at that time. I mean, we obviously we don't want to send cows backwards anytime in their production cycle, but around the time of breeding, there's just a higher standard. And so for fall calving cows, they're a pretty low maintenance animal this time of year, quite frankly. And so I think, you still want to go through some of the forage quantity and quality types of checks and make sure that you're not going to impair, performance of that forage base for the year. And we're not going to ask too much of those cows, but at the same time, they're a little lower maintenance this time of year than our winter calving cows.
Okay, I got at least one more question. As we all know, 6 weeks or so ago, we had a pretty extreme cold temperature, polar vortex. Is there anything we need to have in mind this year due to this extreme cold with regards to our cows?
Well, it's a good question. I don't know that I have a great answer for that. I mean, often we're up against, whatever the weather threw at us this year. And so I think it just speaks to our need to keep cows in reasonably good condition, especially if they are winter calving cows as we go into that winter calving period, because, winter calving is kind of a risky thing to do. And we can argue that, there's some advantages because of fescue toxicosis and heat in the state of Missouri. And certainly that's a reasonable argument to make. But at the same time, it deals us a tough set of cards sometimes in the winter when we actually are calving. And so, those cows may have gone through some challenges from a nutrient perspective. Certainly some challenges if you were having calves during that time. And that's just what we were dealt. And so right now, it's really important to think about all the considerations that I've talked about today as you transition those cows to pasture. And if you ever do want to move calving later, I think we do have some reasonable strategies to try to do more of a true spring calving in the state of Missouri. It just looks a little different.